Nico Bach and Pierre Mitchell joined TraceLink's Roddy Martin to discuss the latest thinking on strategic sourcing, procurement, and supply chain information management. That's right now on the Agile Supply Chain podcast.
Welcome, Nico and Pierre, to another one of TraceLink's subject matter expert webinars on sourcing and procurement and the role in the agile supply chain. So we're not talking in general about sourcing and procurement. We're talking about sourcing and procurement in the end-to-end supply chain. So obviously, we want to start off with the credo that's on my left-hand side, where we emphasize a few values and principles. But let me ask you each to introduce yourselves. I was lucky enough to work with P&G as a trusted advisor for 10 years. So let's hear about your procurement expertise, Pierre, and Nico, your inside P&G expertise. Let's start with Pierre.
Great. Well, hi guys, and welcome everybody. I have, like the rest of you, a long and sordid history in supply chain, and probably almost 30 years between practitioner and advisory experience. Kind of started in supply chain, didn't really kind of end up in procurement. Most people in procurement don't grow up in procurement. They start somewhere else and they somehow land in this weird and wonderful world. So anyway, 25, 30 years kind of split between the practitioner side and also the consulting and advisory side. And a little fun fact, Roddy is the one who kind of got me into the whole IT industry analyst thing, where I've been focused for almost the last 20 years or so on the whole area.
So blame it on me now, Pierre.
It's all right. It turned out okay. I'm happy, Roddy. So thank you, and I'm happy to be here.
Good, Nico.
Yes. Hi everyone. My name is Nico Beck, calling in from Geneva in Switzerland. I've been with Procter & Gamble for 24 years, mainly in supply chain and procurement. And for the last 5 years, I was responsible for digital procurement in P&G. And really based on kind of really driving digital connections with our suppliers, both on the direct and indirect procurement side. And for that, I worked with Pierre and obviously looking at the technology solutions that are out there and really transform the connectivity with our supply chain partners and being far more open and more transparent in providing data to help our partners to become better partners.
Awesome. So let me kick off by talking about this agile supply chain credo. The first thing that's important is it's not about TraceLink, it's not about technology, it's not about a vendor. It's supposed to be agnostic, and we will keep the discussion agnostic. So it's not about whether we use any form of relational database or platform or digital platforms, etc. It's meant to be bland but insightful, right? That's the whole purpose of this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask both Pierre and Nico to tee off what are their immediate responses to the agile supply chain credo. Now, many of you may already know, and especially Nico coming from P&G, that the credo is based on lean and world-class manufacturing. And you never hear P&G people talk about their embedding of lean and world-class manufacturing and agile in the IWS, the integrated work system. But nevertheless, it is. If you listen carefully and you know what you're listening for, you will find where it's been embedded. So let me start by kicking off with you, Pierre, and you, Nico. What is the one aspect of the credo that really jumps out at you when you say, if I say, okay, this is going to be the flip from inside out supply driven to outside in demand driven, you say, whoa, hang on, there's a hell of a lot of stuff that needs to happen here. So what would that be, Pierre, from your point of view, and Nico, from your point of view?
I'll just pick one word, and I think the word is agile and agility. And I think it's a word that it's thrown around. It's been thrown around for a decade, right? But you have to really unpack it to understand what that really means, right? And how organizations are not terribly agile right now, relative to just how they just take the procurement example and look at this integration between procurement and supply chain, right? So think about what integrated supply management, what agile supply means. It means you have to go from an agile supply chain overall in terms of how that, how that works to meet the customer needs, to supply chain supplier segments, kind of critical suppliers versus kind of your lower impact suppliers, to your third tier supplier that's going to be the one that comes up short and like takes down half of your supply chain, to category and category managers on the procurement side and how they manage spend categories, down to individual suppliers, down to the contracts, and down to the line level where the poor buyer planner is trying to figure out how to coordinate all this inbound to actually meet a schedule. So it's a really challenging design problem for procurement to work with supply chain to actually just, at its face, just to be able to set up not just the direct material sourcing contracts, but all, setting up the whole infrastructure around the rest of the players, the contract manufacturers, the CMS, all the different folks that need to be orchestrated, and just making sure that everybody's actually working together to coalesce around the plan and the customer. Because right now, procurement folks are measured on kind of a point function around, price and cost, right? And they don't really get to that balanced scorecard of supply and how do you measure resiliency and flexibility and agility as the antidote to risk. So I know there's a lot in there, but I think that agility piece really captures it, and just the challenge of how do you be agile as a supply chain, and then as the folks managing the supply chain, both procurement and the source and the supply chain folks, trying to work together to manage this whole orchestration. So
yeah, and that's a really couple of good points, and I think agility and resilience stand out to me as being, those are the real challenges. So Nico, what would you add? And you don't need to choose the same as Pierre, but what would you choose as the points that jump out at you?
Well, I would basically pick out the shared data. So we have a lot of suppliers, and I just take you back to my times at P&G, where I was responsible to digitize basically the work processes between P&G and our suppliers. So we have about 70,000 suppliers, 65,000 on the indirect side, about 5,000 on the direct side. And the suppliers on the direct side, so supply chain suppliers, raw material, packaging, contract manufacturing, are really the three main categories, right? And if you look at actually our connectivity with our indirect suppliers is better than our connectivity with our supply chain suppliers, which is interesting because you would expect the opposite to be true. Right. Because obviously when you are a day late with the delivery of shampoo bottles into your factory, your problem is going to be a lot bigger than on the indirect side. And so my focus for the last couple of years has been to increase the connectivity with our supply base on the supply chain side and be far more open in terms of sharing data. Now we have a lot of kind of manual processes that I think they work, but obviously there's much better ways to share data than to send spreadsheets around via email. So we've got kind of a significant B2B connectivity program in place with our biggest suppliers, and actually those suppliers know a lot about our business and they're real partners, and they've grown up with P&G often and provide P&G with the resiliency that we have. And I think in this COVID times, we see that our supply chains are robust and that our relationship with our suppliers are robust, and that we can rely on them to basically deliver the goods, even in this time where we see huge shifts in demands, right? And huge spikes and high and lows because people are stocking up, stocking down, dependent on where the country is in this COVID cycle. But obviously sharing data with suppliers and make them more part of our business or your business, I think is a very important part to the agile supply chain credo that you're talking about here.
Yeah, no, and I think both of your points are well taken. And in fact, if you don't have transparency, visibility, and shared data, then you really can't do move away from the site-centric or country-centric procurement and sourcing that used to happen in P&G when I first started working with P&G. So the second point that I want to raise, and that is resiliency and responsiveness. I mean, it's one of the things that P&G's done is it's codified best practices into IWS. Now, I'm not saying that every practice in the business is codified into IWS, but I would say there's got to be at least 75% of processes that P&G works with that have been codified into IWS. And so how hard was that to, in fact, extract those codified best practices and give them to sourcing and procurement specialists, especially in a digital world? How hard was it to extract those out and say, here is the table of all the best practices that you need to work around? So, I mean, let's start with you, Pierre.
In terms of resiliency and I just focus on that topic. I think one of the challenges that I see just outside of, CPG and pharma and whatever, just in general is so often right now we kind of manage around a process that goes right. And we think about in the perfect world, when it goes well, it's terrific. We think about kind of how we don't manage variability kind of inherently into the process. So just think about a supply plan where we take, out of S&OP coming over into passing some volume, very simple example, volumes over to the buy side. What do we get? We get an average point function. We don't understand the spread of the data. We don't understand the scenarios driving it. We lose all the insight around all the things that can kind of go wrong on the demand side, not even to take into account all the things that can kind of go wrong on the supply side. And this is where there has been some good work on the supply chain risk management side to really understand, what are all the things that can come and bite us? And obviously you can't foresee them all. I mean, COVID was, a gray swan, but it really ended up being a pretty big, dark gray swan, right? So, to actually go and build the playbooks and the business continuity plans, just to understand, to have thought through them and to have some basic playbooks and to know how to recover from them. Those are important. And actually one of the interesting findings is that companies that are starting to build this kind of digitized supply network model and do this type of activity, which they'll also do for sustainability and other things like that, actually allows them to start running these planning scenarios if they're really up to it, if they're sophisticated enough to do it and not just playing around point functions, to actually think about how do I manage under this variability. And that, to me, that's kind of what real resilience is being able to kind of, deliver in the face of all of those, of all the VUCA, the variability and the uncertainty and the complexity and all those things. So I think that's really the test, is to the extent that companies are really being thoughtful around everything that can go wrong and variability on the demand and supply side, and really do something about it. And not just, as Mike Tyson, the boxer, said, everything's great until you get punched in the face, right? That's like with supply risk, everything's great until it actually happens to you, and then it gets real, right? So I think that's the real test of leadership. How do we bake that risk and resiliency into our sourcing processes and into our, our day-to-day activities? So.
That's a couple of good points. Nico, what would you add from a codified best practice perspective in in sourcing and procurement processes? Just what do I resort to? It's perhaps unfair that P&G are the benchmark for, I'm going to say the benchmark, certainly in consumer packaged goods, they are, for me, the benchmark. But being the benchmark, I'm always going to get beaten up because I've said, P&G's done this, P&G has done that. Nico, you were at the thick of that, right? And I'm sure you've heard the Roddy Martin, here goes Roddy again. And I'm not an executive of P&G. What would you say about the challenges inside P&G?
Yeah, I mean, I think that procurement knows a lot about supply chain, right? I mean, Pierre talked before about, being in procurement, being in supply chain. I think procurement professionals spend quite some time on their supply chains and understand kind of how it works, right? By sometimes walking the supply chain, exactly every step that's involved between the supplier, kind of manufacturing the goods and us receiving the goods and making it into finished products. So I think we have a good setup where procurement looks at the end-to-end value that our supplier partners can deliver, right? So not being kind of price buyers, but really be value buyers and look for long-term relationships with our suppliers to drive costs out, quality up, reliability up, etc. I think in terms of best practices and codifying best practices, we have an organization in P&G which we call material supply management, and those folks are really kind of working with the supplier with kind of to get the lead times agreed, kind of site level execution agreements, responsiveness, kind of lead time for emergency deliveries, etc. And those folks are actually part of the procurement function, right? So they're integrated. And as we look at the value that we're looking to deliver with our supplier partners, we look at the entire value, right? And including differences in lead times or responsiveness and reliability between various suppliers, etc. So those are all factors where we have, I think, good data on. So when we make sourcing decisions, we put all those factors into the decision about who's going to be supplying us in the future. And I think, again, that comes back to having good data. Supplier performance data is, a piece of data, supplier quality data, obviously cost performance, innovation performance. And I think we look at this very holistically to ensure that, we grow our business with our best suppliers and we reduce our business with the suppliers that struggle or need a bit of kind of help to get to and become better suppliers. So I think the view is very holistic, and I think that's a big, a big element of looking at that, very integrated versus like going after procurement measure. We're not interested in procurement measures. We're interested in business metrics, right? So.
Well, you see, and that touches on the credo, right? Because the credo says that we are, patient or customer focused outcomes and not just process metrics, not just metrics along the way. I can remember Keith saying, I don't want any one of you to tell me that it left a plant on time or it was in the warehouse, but it still wasn't on the shelf in Walmart or wherever the case may be. So I think the point you've made is really good. And so it does mean that that P&G has to do a really good job together with the retailer, whoever that may be, to ensure that they are signing off an accurate demand forecast plan, literally in blood, because they can't get it wrong. If they get it wrong, then it's going to be a disaster because there's going to be excess inventory. And I always used to laugh at Jake Bar when I would go to the local Ocean State job lot, and I'd see a whole, let's say boxes and boxes of Tide, but not Tide pods. And he said, so he said, can you see any Tide pods around there? And I said, no. I said, what's going on? And he said, that's the flushing process to get Tide in its traditional containers through the stores and make space for the Tide pods that are on their way. Now you know how long ago that was, right? So, but it's a good indicator of planning. So P&G is planning 1 to 2 to 3 years ahead to get the whole chain moving. And whatever you've signed off in that 3-year chain, 2-year chain, is an important step for P&G's sourcing and procurement processes. You don't just wake up in 6 months' time and say, hey, I think we're going to launch a new green, whatever the case may be, green Tide pod for St. Patrick's Day. So I think that was a very good point. And I think that in many senses, people listening to this are going to say, well, hey, P&G, I haven't heard them talk about demand forecast accuracy or demand forecast. So maybe we've missed something. Well, I think that there's a whole process that runs in material supply management and the standards and the IWS standards that lay the foundations for every product in the run up to codifying a product and signing off an order and handing it to production and say, off you go. It's not a mad scramble where you have 60% demand forecast accuracies and people are running around like chickens without heads. It's not like that. And I think that's an important sort of factor of the reliable, agile supply chain credos. You've got to have that basic capability in place in order to, once that plan is signed off, it's kind of like the vaccine process, let's say, like the vaccine process. So that's an important one. I think, Pierre and Nico, if I asked each one of you, what are each of your stop and starts that you would make a recommendation to P&G in respect of getting ready and more agile and resilient with the supply chain and demand forecast accuracy, and in a sense building that resiliency that we've been talking about. So Pierre, how about we kick off with you?
Well, God, that's who am I to tell P&G what to do on such a broad question? I'll let Nico make those recommendations. I will get tactical around, and if you will, around one aspect, which is, Nico mentioned kind of the data and the importance of it, and that is something that we certainly spend a lot of time like working with clients around, thinking through their data strategy and their procurement and their supply chain data management and modeling, the master data. What do they want to own? What do they parse out to third parties to manage different types of spend and suppliers, and what processes and things like that. So I would say, since the information is kind of a raw material, it is part of the supply chain, right? I think thinking through the information flow and how you manage the information architecture is critical. And I know, Roddy, you're an architecture geek from way back. One of the things I appreciated with you from the beginning, and I think it is that those issues have not gone away, and they become even more important in terms of, and this is why. And actually, I was working with Deloitte to do the latest CPO study, and the issue around data accuracy and fidelity and availability, that the gap between that and everything else has just widened, because everybody is really dying to get the real-time analytics that they need to see the risks, to see the opportunities, to just manage the business. And in a very mixed topology of lots of systems with ERP and supply chain and spend management and all the supplier systems and the third parties and managed services, IT is pulling their hair out just from a cloud governance and IT risk standpoint, but trying to actually put a layer on top of it, like you were talking about before, Roddy, and some of the work that P&G did. That's absolutely critical, and anybody can kind of get started on that. You just kind of need to figure out where to pick your battles and how to get started. So for procurement organizations, it might be just starting with spend, and then suppliers, and then supply chain, and then contracts. Everyone will have a different journey, but I think that's one of the biggest things, is really to think about through the information that you really need to manage, and provide that resiliency, then work backwards to the physical systems that are third-party systems or what you own. But more and more, it's companies building their own analytics layer and master data layers, so they can really own their own destiny from some of those decision-making and any of the stuff they want to do around AI, where that might be truly differentiated and things like that. So I would say that thinking through the data and the data architecture and the information, supply network, as well as the actual physical supply network, is really important. And only, I think, some of the best companies are even thinking about how to really organize that information cohesively to support what you're talking about. So.
Yeah, those are good insights. And Nico, what would you add to Pierre's comments?
Yeah, well, I think data is everything, right? And companies have a lot of data, but the trick is, how do you combine it together to get you insights, right? So supplier quality data is usually owned by QA, right? So they have their systems, but how do we ensure that in sourcing we take it into account when we make sourcing decisions? delivery performance of supplier is owned by the planner buyer organization, right? So they're not the ones that decide, which supplier is going to get the business next time round. But the data that they create about the reliability of the supply chain and how good the delivery performance is of the supplier is important for sourcing to make the right decisions, right? So it's all about how you bring that data together. And you should start with what you think is the most important data, right? So I think for a company like Procter & Gamble, our supply chains are hugely important. And I think the performance, delivery performance and quality performance of our suppliers are really key data elements for us to get to the right sourcing decisions and recommendations, right? So in terms of your kind of stop and start, this is kind of, I think people should really, or procurement should really stop being price buyers. And still there are some price buyers out there sometimes. And especially in today's time, it's not a very smart approach. I think there's all these other elements that are way more important than, if a supplier gives you a 3 or 5% discount. And also, I think when you then are with the right supply base and you have really partners for your business, you should treat them as partners and you should trust them and you should really make them part of your business, right? And I think there's many good examples, in the tech sector where, the business has been created by a ecosystem of suppliers versus, and that's really the ecosystem of suppliers is what made that supply chain unbeatable, either from a resiliency point of view, from an innovation point of view, or whatever you're looking for. But it's the ecosystem of suppliers and then being able to share data with your suppliers on either the needs for innovation or kind of, bringing data together to make the supply chains more robust. We often go into kind of second level buying. And of course, there's also important that, our data is shared with our suppliers and our suppliers share the data with their suppliers, right? And I think that is kind of one step deeper in the supply chain, but I think very important to make a resilient supply chain, because if your supplier doesn't have the feedstock they need to produce for you, you're still going to be out of product, right? So,
Yeah.
So I think let's also look deeper into the supply chain than just the one level and the folks that you're paying the materials to.
So it actually, what you said and what Pierre said is actually quite closely aligned, because what Pierre said was, look at the flow of information, look at the process architecture. You're saying, look at the way the data is stored and make sure that you can share it and that you can come to some smart results. Because then once you nail down a demand forecast and say, okay, we're going to make to X, we will make to X. And the chances are that if we make to X and we only make 3/4 of X or 90% of X, we can respond quite quickly because we know quite well where the problem happened. So I think that those are really, really good points.
Hey, Roddy, one thing I just add in is just to think of strategic sourcing in the procurement world as really extended supply network redesign, right? When you are changing suppliers, when you're finding new suppliers and looking at their suppliers and trying to have some influence that, and Nico's right around high tech or whatever, you are in fact doing extended kind of network design when you are doing strategic sourcing, right? So you better be thinking about how you're creating, are you going to create a very fragile network, right? And very focused with suppliers who are, you've self-selected to be focused on price, and you're going to be change ordered to death in the services world, right? That happens. Or are you going to really pick true partners, right? And they're going to be selecting you as much as you're selecting them. This term of the customer of choice, right? That's a real thing. The best suppliers are choosy, and they're gonna want to work with Honda and P&G and the ones that are going to make them better and give them competitive advantage. So for procurement supply chain organizations that are back at level 1, level 2 of whatever maturity model, there's a real strategic disadvantage that you might not even see, because those best suppliers are already doing things light years ahead of what you would be doing, because you'd just be dragging them down, right? So it's really important.
No, and I'm glad you brought that up. That's the reason why when I touted that CIFSA 5-stage model as the maturity model for supply chain when we were all working together on demand-driven value networks, there was a really good reason for that. And that's because of the statement you just made. I can have a huge argument with you about, well, why can't you do that? And well, I couldn't even do that. So if 2 steps before that, I was already at a broken stage, then we need to redefine that as a milestone and head for milestones that make business value sense in the overall demand forecasting process. So that, those were good insights, and I think it's indicative of how deep the supply chain goes into procurement, sourcing, and I'm going to add finance. I mean, I interviewed an ex-GE finance CFO at a hospital, and he said, Roddy, we get supply chain teams come in and they want to teach us supply chain, and it's complicated. They've given us way too much information, and all we want to do is to be able to make decisions around buffers of inventory. And when we say, well, why is that $500 million worth of inventory sitting over there? Then they get agitated. And so the bottom line is, if you understand the flow of the process and the flow of data and the structure of information flows and the lead times, you're probably going to get it right. So I think that's a good vindication of the outside-in pivot that I certainly saw P&G go through when I was working with them. So, I think the time is almost up. So I'm going to say thank you to both Pierre and to Nico.
Thanks, Roddy. Appreciate it.